What is happening on this thin, rocky island? It's way out in the freezing Arctic, far north of even Russia and Scandinavia's northernmost shores. Nothing more than a barren rock, an empty line on the map. No roads, no settlements, no reason to care about it. But zoom in a bit and look what we see. Bits of wood strewn everywhere on the beaches. Odd little buildings in random spots. This group of buildings in the island's middle. What happened here? I knew there would be a good story here, so, of course, I went down the rabbit hole again to dig it up. As always with these isolated places, nothing comes easy. Everything worth knowing was hard to find, but I struck gold. Old handwritten Norwegian hunting logs, forgotten expedition reports, buried Norwegian newspaper articles, legal documents from governments. I saw that this tiny, overlooked island standing in Spitsbergen's shadow was hiding far more layers than I expected. Desperate survival from shipwrecks stranded for months in the polar night, Cold War secrets of crashed aircraft that nearly sent Norway and the Soviet Union to war, and more. Today we're going to uncover the full story of Hopen Island. So let's poke around at it on satellite maps. It sits in the Barents Sea in the far North Arctic, 80 kilometres away from Svalbard and over 600 kilometres away from mainland Norway. It's 300 kilometres as the crow flies from any inhabited place on Svalbard. It's unbelievably isolated. Hopen is about 33 kilometres long and only a few kilometres wide, another Chile-style landmass. If you look at it side on, it has some high mountains, plenty of them covered in ice and deep scars and folds. This curious little sand swirl at its northern tip. You can even see that it's surrounded by pack ice in the seas. As I showed earlier, there are structures on the island. A small northern hut here, a weird structure here with tons of wood strewn around it, what looks like a settlement here with modern buildings, another tiny building with wood scattered all around it here, a tower-like structure here, a few small structures around it, one that looks destroyed by the shoreline, and the only structure on the island's western side here. If you know anything about this bit of the Arctic, you'll know that plenty of Europeans have been here, and, spoiler alert, Europeans have known about Hopen for a long while. However, even so, I always like to check if any indigenous people went first, even just for a visit or lived there, though it seems Hopen has had neither. This place is so far up and harsh, a true Arctic no man's land. Long and dark winters, 4 months of polar night surrounded by thick ice, temperatures below -10 degrees, strong winds, blizzards, thick fog, permafrost. It's one of the toughest places a human being could live. The closest indigenous people are the Nenets on the Barents coast and the Sami in northern Scandinavia. They do fish in the Arctic, but they're not really known for long-distance ship journeys. Hopen is hundreds of kilometres away with tons of sea ice and strong undercurrents in between. It's unlikely they or anyone ever tried coming up to Hopen or even knew about it. So, next question. Who was the first to actually see Hopen then? Our first claim comes from none other than the mighty Norse Vikings. I found 2 medieval Icelandic documents that give us some food for thought about Hopen. The first is the 1194 Icelandic Annals. Look here, years 1194 to 1206. Sverrir vigr til konungs, Svalbardi fundin. Sverrir made king. Svalbard found. The second is a 12th to 13th century book about how Iceland was settled called Landnámabók, and look here. This translates to, from Langanes on Iceland's northern sides, it's about 4 days sailing north to Svalbard in the sea. These are the earliest written references to Svalbard, and if the Norse truly discovered Svalbard, they might have also included Hopen or seen it from a distance or even went up to it. Though their Svalbard could have just been Jan Mayen or something else. There's another speculative first claim to Svalbard from the Russian Pomors. Pomors are hunters and fishermen who live on North Russia's White Sea coast. And during the Cold War, Soviet archaeologists tried to claim and prove that they got to Svalbard in the early 1500s before anyone else. The evidence for this is pretty muddy, but if they truly did get to Svalbard, they also might have been the first to see Hopen on the way. One last speculative Svalbard discovery claim is from the Portuguese. There's a Portuguese map called the Cantino Planisphere from around the year 1500, and if you look to the map's north, you can see a few little islands. They look suspiciously like Svalbard, don't they? You could infer from this that Portugal must have found or known about Svalbard, but this could have been done randomly by the map maker to make the map look nicer or to suggest there was unexplored land up there. So it's highly unlikely for the Portuguese, definitely maybe for the Norse and Pomors, but a big 100% for the Dutch. Svalbard was eventually discovered officially by Dutchmen Willem Barents and Jan Rijp on their 1596 expedition. Around this time, Portugal and Spain were obsessed with spices and had a few trade routes under their control. The English and Dutch wanted a piece of the spice route pie, so they wanted to get around Portugal and Spain's routes by sailing around Russia's north. The Barents and Rijp expedition is really interesting, by the way. After discovering Svalbard, Willem Barents wanted to keep going around Novaya Zemlya, but Jan Rijp disagreed, so they agreed to split up. Jan Rijp sailed free in the seas, and because of that fact and some future maps, historians infer that he might have been the first man to see Hopen. Willem Barents pushed eastwards to Novaya Zemlya, but got stuck in heavy ice, which crushed his ship. The crew was forced to get off and do an unplanned overwintering. They built a wood cabin out of driftwood and pieces of their trapped ship. The cabin was actually rediscovered, and loads of artefacts were still preserved in the permafrost. So while some claim Jan Rijp saw Hopen first, there is another claim. By the early 1600s, tons of expeditions were sent up to Svalbard in a mad rush to take resources from it. There were tons of whales there, and whale oil was in demand in Europe, where it was used as street lamp fuel, in manufacturing textiles, and for soap making. One such expedition was done in 1613 by Thomas Marmaduke from Hull, Yorkshire. Instead of doing what he was supposed to be doing, it seems he ended up exploring Svalbard for fun. He was ordered to stop because he was jeopardising the expedition, but he kept on disobeying and went on to discover our long, narrow island and named it after a ship he once commanded, the Hopewell. I couldn't find first-hand sources for his expedition, but the evidence for his discovery is the Muscovy Company 1625 map. You can clearly see Hopen with its 1613 discovery date. By the mid to late 1600s, overhunting had taken its toll on Svalbard's waters. There used to be loads of bowhead whales, but their populations nosedived. As a result, the Dutch and English stopped whaling around Svalbard and Hopen since it was just no longer worth sending ships up there to come back empty-handed. The only other mention of Hopen I could find during this time was a fishing ship, Wetenrenners, shipwrecking at Hopen in July 1836 after a walrus hunting trip. This small power vacuum left on Svalbard was filled by Norwegians. They had already hunted in Svalbard as far back as 1796, since polar bear and fox pelts were really valuable in Norway. Through this, Svalbard's good hunting spots got saturated. This is where Hopen comes in. It had got quite the reputation for being absolutely packed full of polar bears. New hunters were looking for their own spots away from the taken Svalbard spots, and Hopen was the next hope for them. They built the permanent structures on Hopen that you can see today, so let's learn about them. In 1908, the first documented Norwegian hunting expedition to Hopen happened. This expedition was an overwintering funded by I.A. Killengreen or Killengreen and Son, which seems to be a business based in Tromsø, Norway. There are Norwegian digital archive records for two guys called Richard Killengreen, presumably father and son, who were the company owners. One was an active politician in Tromsø. A small group of hunters went up and built 3 huts to stay in. Nordhytta towards the island's north, Sørhytta in the south, and Nilsebu in between, named after one of the hunters, Wilhelm Nielsen. The expedition itself was led by Salomon Fylkesnes and August Olafsson, and other crew included Johan Eriksson Thune and Fridtjof Nicolaisen, though I couldn't find any more info on either of them except for a potential photo of August Olafsson in this Norsk Polarklubben document, and some details about Fridtjof Nicolaisen's overwinterings on this webpage. There was one more crewman that I did find a lot on, and he turned out to be quite the character. Henry Rudy, originally from Tromsø, started his young working life as a shopkeeper, but quickly grew incredibly bored with it. When he was just 19, he wanted to go hunt with his heroes, Tromsø's Arctic hunters. He was absolutely in it for the love of the game. He ended up overwintering 28 times on Svalbard, 10 on Greenland, and once on Jan Mayen. Even his brother Olaf became a hunter, though he died on an expedition. Henry killed over 700 polar bears in his life, earning him the nickname Isbjørnkongen, the polar bear king. He became quite the legend. There are lots of stories about him that I dug up. He set up his own folk festival in Tromsø after a successful overwintering, buying 500 litres of beer. He took 2 polar bear cubs and raised them for a few months after he had shot their mother. I found a Nordlys article from June 1999 about it. He called one of them Maya, taught her to drink beer, and cried when he had to sell her. He saved his fellow crewman Wilhelm Nielsen many times from multiple polar bear attacks on Hopen in 1908, which sounds a bit Looney Tunes to me. Henry eventually retired from hunting and became a popular storyteller, spending most of his time at Ølhallen in Tromsøya, which is actually still there today. Sørhytta was renamed Rudihytta after him. In 1958, writer Lars Sørensen wrote a book about him. There's even a 2-episode TV series called Svalbard 1964 featuring him. You can watch it online, but it's in Norwegian without English subtitles. I found another newspaper article from the 24th of March 1959, when Henry Rudi celebrated his 70th birthday with friends at a gathering. Henry died on June 15, 1970. Ølhallen has photos of him on the walls and his seat is marked out. On top of that, if you do go to Tromsø, their Polar Museum has a permanent Henry Rudi expedition. After the 1908 Hopen expedition with Henry Rudi and the fellas, there were no more up there until 1923. No first-hand source again though, only a few mentions of it online. However, I dug up some information. It was led by, forgive my pronunciation, Ludolf Schjelderup. There's a record of him buying a ship called the Takaheimen. The Bandal Ishavsmuseet had an exhibition about him. He bought the same ship that Shackleton died on. There were 3 more guys, August Hansen, Sverre Sørensen and Carl Herl. They built 2 huts on Hopen, Beisarhytta or Beisarstua, Hopen's northernmost man-made structures, and they are these buildings that we see here on satellite maps. Straight after the 1923 expedition, another fascinating guy visited Hopen. Oslo oceanographer Thor Iversen, the first to bring along a camera. He went a few times in the 20s and 30s and wrote an incredible book, Ishavsøya Hopen. Thor Iversen first saw Hopen in 1923 in the distance, and in 1924 he landed on its southern tip a few times with marine biologist Einar Koffert. Einar took plant samples while the others climbed Hopen's mountains and left cairns. Iversen measured passes, flat spots and mapped everything with a 6-metre bamboo pole. They dug wells and waited for them to fill up, confirming that you could get fresh water there. They saw walrus bones, sea cucumbers, seabirds and polar bear tracks. He wrote about how quickly the weather changed, how foggy it could get and how tough it was to even sail up close. He was particularly interested in Hopen because back then it was a wandering island. It had changed shape on different maps because fog, drift ice and other obstacles make it really hard to chart. Iversen wanted to get to the bottom of the mystery himself, and at the end of the book you can find his Hopen map with precise markings for everything, putting right hundreds of years of inaccuracies. In the end, 2 Hopen landmarks are named after Thor Iversen. The tallest mountain is called Iversensfjellet and the island's southmost tip, Cape Thor. In one curious tale in the book, they went to Rudihytta and found a mysterious message chalked on the wall. Hogendorp, Org 19/8. I'm in a Norwegian house without any provisions. Honestly, this story sounded absolutely mad, so I went digging further for it. Andreas Willem Count van Hogendorp from Breda in North Brabant was born in 1897. The article gives where he lived, this address here, this one in Rotterdam. Hogendorp took part in rowing and athletics competitions and worked at the Dutch Spitsbergen company. Somehow he became involved with the rescue operation for the airship Italia that had crashed on Spitsbergen. Read up on that if you have time, it's really interesting. Somehow they mistakenly dropped him off on Hopen instead of on Spitsbergen. He was left there and nearly starved and froze to death, but was luckily rescued after 3 weeks by a seal hunter who saw signs that Hogendorp had drawn with rocks on the beach. He apparently speared a polar bear for food, a warm fur coat and oil grease for his lamp. After this fiasco, the 1930s came and saw a few more Norwegian Hopen overwinterings. The Svalbard Treaty was being signed at this point because of interest in coal mining and other industries on Svalbard, so what was a lawless no man's land before became more officially governed by Norway, who were given the claim. Hopen was also officially Norwegian from then on. Maja Olsen and Johannes Johansen overwintered in 1930 to 1931. Another overwintering in 1934 to 1935 was done by Børre Trohaug, his son Birger Trohaug, and Sigurd Storstad. These guys built a new hut, Storstadhuset, after Sigurd Storstad, near Nilsebu, which could be one of these on satellite images. 2 years later, Harald Wallem and Johan Nielsen overwintered in 1936 to 1937. In 1939, the Svalbard office went up to map Hopen, and then, of course, something else you might know about happened in 1939. World War II broke out. Speaking of World War II, the Germans occupied Norway in the early 40s, so Britain, Canada and Norway basically emptied Svalbard. All mines, stockpiles and radio stations were destroyed to make it useless, and any staff living or working there were sent home. Then, in the middle of the war, Hopen became the stage for one of the most harrowing Arctic survival stories of World War II. In 1942, a Russian steamship, the Dekabrist, was on a secret mission sent by the Allied forces across the Barents Sea to supply the USSR against Germany. Eastwards they sailed, passing beneath Jan Mayen, then Surkap, then kept pushing east. Then, fate was not on their side. They got spotted by a German aircraft. The Germans attacked the Dekabrist for a painstaking 2 whole hours, tearing holes into its fore-rigging, causing it to take on water. The crew tried to seal up the ship's hull holes using pieces of the deck, but it wasn't good enough. Water slowly seeped in. As the wind picked up in the evening, they knew they'd have no choice but to abandon ship. 80 crew members scrambled into lifeboats, bringing weapons and equipment, even a cat and a dog, and laid down, hoping to stay unseen by the Germans overhead. Overnight, they drifted a few miles from the Dekabrist. In the morning, German planes flew over and bombed it again, splitting it into 2 and sinking it for good this time. Luckily for the crew, the German pilots had not spotted them in their lifeboats. They needed to sail to faraway but friendly Soviet lands southwards, but then they sighted Hopen in the distance and decided to land there. They drifted around it for 10 days and eventually the waves pushed them ashore. There were 18 men and 1 woman, the ship's doctor. 2 men died on the first day, but the surviving crew pushed north and found a cabin with a cooking stove inside, though their luck was to take another turn for the worse. A sudden storm blew in and whipped up powder snow, making it hard to breathe without rags on their mouths, and they dare not shut the hut door for fear of being suffocated by the fire smoke inside. One by one, they started dying off, gangrene and frostbite in their limbs and faces. Eventually, only 3 were left, a sailor, the captain and the doctor, with yet another big problem incoming. Around January, pack ice forms and polar bears come to Hopen on their migration routes. Luckily for them, the captain managed to trap one, along with a fox, to get fur to cover themselves with, blubber to make oil, and meat to eat. They kept going until spring when the ice melted a bit and then headed southwards from their northern cabin. They reached Husdalen, where they found some supplies washed ashore from other lifeboats, but luck still was not on their side. Some German pilots had spotted them after overflying Hopen, and now they knew they were survivors, though the Germans did drop them food and supplies. A German submarine came to the island and the 3 surviving Dekabrist crew members finally gave themselves up after 11 months on Hopen. They were ordered onto the German submarine and put into a prison camp, but all 3 survived the war. The doctor and sailor even got married afterwards, and the doctor and captain sailed for years after the war. The doctor retired in 1979. You can still see the cabins they stayed in. The northern one is here near Stigdalen. The Dekabrist one is the more destroyed one. The one further south was probably Nilsebu or Storstadhuset from previous expeditions. A few years after wrecking the Dekabrist, the Germans wanted another Svalbard win for themselves in the form of putting the weather stations destroyed by the Allied forces back up. They put one on Hopen in Nilsebu and staffed it with an overwintering crew of 4. In May 1945, Germany surrendered, but the crew kept working until August. It seems they just had no other way off Hopen until finally someone decided to go up and pick them up. Afterwards, Norway took over the undertakings the Germans had started, and every year 4 men were sent to overwinter. These are the modern buildings we see in the island's middle. And at this point, I dug up the biggest piece of treasure from this whole video. 4 handwritten Norwegian journals describing the 1953-54 overwintering in great detail, written by 24-year-old Gunnar Larsen. I couldn't find a digital version of it anywhere, but thanks to my patrons, I was able to pay for a transcription, summary and translation. I thought it would be a waste of time, but it turned out to have some of the most vivid stories and details of any source on Hopen. Gunnar Larsen also took a camera with him, and his hundreds of photos can be found online. In summer 1953, crew members Ragnar Hofsøy, Knut Vrolstad, Gunnar Larsen, Peter Poulsen and Johannes Nygård went up to man Hopen's weather station. They first took the overnight train from Oslo to Tromsø, with Gunnar Larsen gazing out of the train window where he found Sweden boring but was spellbound by northern Norway's fjords and midnight sun. They got to Tromsø where they would set sail to Hopen, and it all started smooth, but the sea quickly turned rough with swells, making Gunnar really seasick. They got to Hopen at night and unloaded the boat in a record 3 hours. On one of the first days, Gunnar got his legs stuck sinking in a bog where he panicked at first but escaped by slipping his feet out of his sinking rubber boots. In the first few weeks, the loneliness started to grip at him. He even wrote about a vivid dream he had of being with a woman and jokingly wrote that at least dreaming about women didn't cost him a single penny. To distract himself from the isolation, Gunnar read an absolute pile of books to pass the time, and he discusses each one thoughtfully in the journal. The graft was hard too. Together, the crew built a sauna, lugging and dragging timber in the pouring rain, and when they eventually got it finished, they put in the stove and enjoyed the heat, which became a regular getaway from the bitter cold outside. It was so freezing that Gunnar could barely pull his gun trigger when bird hunting for meat. Gunnar wrote about food basically every day. The crew really looked forward to every meal, even if it was crap. They ate seal, bird, polar bear, potatoes, and had beer or wine on Sundays. Despite the harsh conditions, lots of adventures were had. The crew once heard mysterious engine-like noises outside the huts and went looking for them, but never found anything and couldn't explain it. They explored many of Hopen's sites. Beaches littered with walrus carcasses, Iversensfjellet where they looked out at Svalbard's faraway peaks, and even Rusehytta, used by the Dekabrist survivors, to find Russian newspapers, a samovar, some old bread with Russian writing on it, and even eerie human remains. One time the island supply plane dropped some things off for them, but later they got reports of it having crashed on nearby Bjørnøya. All on board died except one, and Gunnar felt really strange having watched them fly over Hopen hours earlier, only to now hear about them crashing and dying. It was nice to read that the crew overall got on quite well with each other. They celebrated Knut's 25th birthday with cakes, pastries and lots of drinks. Gunnar seems to have got on really well with Ragnar. They shared many philosophical talks. In one story, Gunnar cut his own hair and shaved his beard, and when the others saw him, they laughed so hard that they were wheezing, and the following day they shaved their own beards to make each other laugh. At night, they had long discussions about politics, the hydrogen bomb, and human nature, played card games, and brewed their own alcohol. Things started to go a bit south with Peter, though, who became more and more grating as time went on. He interrupted the others endlessly, boasted and exaggerated his stories, and didn't pull his weight, watching others struggle without helping. One time a fuel drum fell overboard while they were out sailing, which Peter pointed out but did nothing to help out as Gunnar and Ragnar hauled it back onto the boat. And one fateful night, the crew simply lost their patience with Peter. Scientists from another ship visited Hopen and they held a lively, boozy party. Peter seemed scared to start drinking, but then he just couldn't stop, getting rowdier and rambling nonsense. He eventually pulled a shoemaker's knife on Knut. The crew decided together that Peter had to leave Hopen and told him to his face. He wandered off, leather drunk, and they found him delirious, crying in a ditch without his shoes or socks on, convinced he'd been fighting Russian soldiers. He was sent back to Norway on a boat, where he behaved well and checked himself into a hospital. Sounds like he had PTSD episodes from World War II, since he often talked himself up as a kind of war hero. The crew got a replacement steward, Vibard, who they got on with much better. Gunnar wrote a lot about the station's dogs. Buster was sweet, clever, and enjoyed cuddling. Kulle was a stubborn grump but a good leader, and Trulte was a typical girly dog, gentle and calm. They kept the crew entertained, but more importantly, they kept them safe. They were better at picking up when polar bears were nearby. Trulte eventually had puppies, though sadly one of them got attacked by a bear and one of the crew had to put it down out of mercy, which deeply upset them all, especially Trulte herself. Gunnar really goes into some personal, intimate moments in his journals and lays bare his feelings. He wrote about feeling overwhelmingly fearful and paranoid walking alone to Rudihytta one day, seeing polar bear tracks all around him and worrying about being attacked or mauled to death, given his bad shooting skills. He once wrote of a letter from home asking when he would come back, with a message either from his son or his young brother saying he missed him. Another letter came to him in the form of a job offer as a radio operator in Norway when his Hopen overwintering was done, which he was happy about. He dreamed of a normal flat, a wife, family, books, mountain hikes and fishing. Despite all the really cruel hunting that they did, Gunnar showed great sympathy and respect towards animals and wrote about them almost every day. They had trapped a blue fox and Gunnar was actually happy it had escaped by biting through its trap. He said that he hoped it hadn't damaged his teeth. Another time there was a curious tame fox that followed them up a mountain, and he wrote about it with great admiration. He came across an injured bird and remarked at its beauty, though had to mercifully end its suffering so it wouldn't die slowly. All the bear hunting made him feel really torn. They needed the meat and the furs, but he felt it was really unfair. He said he felt like they were just ruthless snipers killing for nothing more than money and questioned mankind's right to such mindless violence. Eventually winter came and brought below zero temperatures, snowfall and rough winds. As the polar night drew nearer, the sun barely peeked over the horizon, and once it finally set for good, darkness enshrouded them 24/7, though Gunnar marvelled at the starry winter night sky. Of course, spring came back around, bringing the birds back to Hopen, breaking up the sea ice. Gunnar marvelled at the flowers blooming all over the island, though at this point the overwintering was nearing its end and the days were dragging. In the end, the relief ship finally got there to take them home and they enjoyed one last sauna trip before loading up their belongings. Gunnar had built up to this moment for months by now, but he said he felt somewhat emotionally numb and underwhelmed after so much build-up. However, once back in Norway, he was happy to see land and was even surprised by his father, who had made the 2-day journey to meet his son at Tromsø harbour. Reflecting afterwards, Gunnar said that the overwintering had made him grow as a person and he now took greater pleasure in nature and was less disinterested in other people. He said he didn't regret it at all, though he never ended up going back to Hopen. The Hopen overwintering went on in the 50s with other crews, though there are only a few details online about them. There is something interesting but tragic from the 1956-57 overwintering, however. Remember Johannes Nygaard from Gunnar Larsen's overwintering? Well, he went back for another 2 Hopen overwinterings, and if you scan over Hopen on Map Carter, you'll find the only building on the island's west side, just over from the main weather station, labelled Joshytta. Johannes Nygaard built it on this overwintering, mostly out of driftwood logs from the west beach and some towed over from the east beach, just like the station sauna, which he had helped build with Gunnar Larsen. But Johannes' story mysteriously ends here. He took a trip out alone in early December 1956 and just never came back. In the following year's spring, his body was found not far from the main station. I couldn't find anything on how he died or what his crewmates had to say about the situation. He was just gone. A few interesting things happened in the 60s. For the 1968-69 overwintering, crewman Øystein Kille took a video camera and filmed on Hopen. There was a program released about it in the 80s called Telegrafist og Bjørnejæger that you can actually watch online for free on nrk.tv. There's a kind of interview with one of the 69-70 crewmen, Tor Olav Bjørnsen, about the weather, supply drops and fishing. Apparently, tragedy struck on this same overwintering too, when a radio operator went overboard near the weather station and they never found his body. Another mysterious Hopen death, bringing the 60s to a close. While the 60s were pretty quiet on Hopen, the 1970s were anything but. Underlining the first half of the decade was the Norwegian branch of Belgian oil company Petrofina, Norske Fina. Oil had been found in the North Sea, and the Barents Sea was the next oil target, especially Svalbard. The Svalbard Treaty let companies mine on Svalbard's land and gave equal mining rights to signing countries. Hopen, therefore, became a cheap and easy oil test site. Bjørnebo was built 100 metres from Rusehytta, Nilsebu was fixed up, and Beisastua was rebuilt, all to help with the drilling. 2 oil wells were drilled on Hopen, but no oil was found in all Svalbard, just a sad bit of natural gas. In that same year, 1973, Norway passed polar bear protection laws. Hunting them was thenceforth banned and killing them was not allowed. Hopen basically changed from a hunter hotspot to a serious scientific research station. Remember when I said Hopen almost brought Norway to war with the Soviet Union? Well, here's where you find out the whole story. The year was 1978, and as normal, 4 Norwegian crewmen were overwintering on Hopen, manning the weather station. Yet the 28th of August turned out to be anything but normal. One crewman, Gunnar Larsen, was eating his lunch when he heard a loud bang. At first, nothing weird could be seen from the station, so the crew shrugged it off and put it down to a thunderclap or a rogue shot from a nearby naval ship. However, 2 days later, it was Arna's birthday, so he and another crewman celebrated with a special walk to Rudihytta. The fog around them was thick and heavy, visibility was really low. As they walked, they came across some mysterious deep markings in the ground leading up Werenskjoldfjellet. So, curious and a bit unsettled, the fellas decided to climb up the steep mountain to have a nosy. What they came across was nothing short of unbelievable. Some huge wheels and metal axles with Cyrillic writing on them, a severed woman's hand with well-groomed fingernails, scattered pistols and ammunition belts for machine guns, long rolls of unexposed reconnaissance film. It was unmistakably a crashed Soviet military aircraft. They ran back to the station to raise the alarm, where the telegraphist sent a coded message to the Norwegian Armed Forces and to Oslo. "We have received an eagle from the east in the head." They were given orders to keep quiet, to give Norway time to assess the situation without the Soviets knowing, since the Soviets didn't know where their plane had gone down. There were already tensions between Norway and the USSR over Svalbard. Norwegian media had exposed a secret Soviet helicopter base and a radar station there, and the Soviets had previously recovered a crashed helicopter of theirs on Svalbard without telling Norway. The Norwegians felt the Soviets were taking the piss out of Norway's Svalbard sovereignty, so they wanted to stand firm against them and reach the crash site before the Soviets. The aircraft was a Tupolev Tu-16 Badger recon bomber carrying 7 crew members, all killed in the crash. The first theory they had was that the plane's crew had misnavigated in the bad weather and weren't overflying Hopen on purpose. Soaked maps, cockpit material and highly classified Soviet military information were all found in the wreckage. It was a treasure trove for the West that might help crack encrypted Soviet communications. Now, if they had been dried off on Hopen, the Soviets would have got their hands on them, so they were instead flown over to Longyearbyen to an intelligence chief's home for analysis. But the Soviets were only told that they'd been sent to Longyearbyen. Now the Soviets were getting pretty cheesed off, and the Soviets answered. Not long after, on September the 1st in the morning, Soviet submarine periscopes were spotted near Hopen, along with a heavily armed Soviet missile cruiser. The Soviets demanded to be let land straight away to take the wreckage and bodies, but Norway stood fast and they said 2 more days to investigate. No more Soviets on Hopen shores. One of the Soviets on shore had put some things into a bag, but one of the Norwegians had spotted him. Svalbard's governor demanded the bag be handed over. The flight recorder was even more drama. The Soviets insisted only their experts could read it. Norway wanted to send it to London for analysis, which annoyed the Soviets even more, though eventually it was agreed to be opened in Norway and only read the accident data, nothing more. They opened it in a bunker behind an explosion barrier in case it had been rigged. They read the data, which backed up the theory. Navigation failure, with clear signs of a desperate last-minute climb. It was suspected that the aircraft crew had been flying low with the radars off in order to fly over new Norwegian radar installations on Svalbard to intercept their broadcasts. But amidst the fog, they hadn't spotted Hopen before, tragically, it was too late. Of course, Norway got cheeky with this one. They had read everything on the recorder, not just the accident data, and when documents were handed back to the Soviets, only Norway-related material was included, sneakily showing the Soviets that Norway now knew what they had been writing about them. The 80s and 90s on Hopen were much more chilled out. A cabin, funnily called Casablanca, got flown onto a mountain but was torn to bits by polar bears. Hopen got its own official post office with a walrus stamp, and Oddmund Søreide wrote a book in 1994 about Hopen's history. There was a really cool cultural heritage survey done in 1998 and 2000 inspired by Thor Iversen. And here's the document that I found from it. The team carried copies of Iversen's old photos to see the island as he had seen it and to recreate them, along with notes to follow in his footsteps. They wrote daily logs each evening on a small computer by paraffin lamp and candlelight, sheltering in old huts in bad standing with leaking roofs, mould build-up and water on the floor. Despite this though, they were having a fun time sitting together reading Iversen's writings. They also went with Ole Andreas Ottesen, who had overwintered in 1949-50 and told stories of the place, which made the trip that much more exciting. They also spoke with Oddmund Søreide over satellite phone, who had written the book that I mentioned earlier. As they moved around Hopen, they found layer upon layer of human history. They found and GPS tagged many of Thor Iversen's cairns, plenty of wildlife as well. Curious Arctic foxes often came up to the crew. The boys were fully aware that they were roaming through polar bear country since they saw fresh tracks almost daily and came across quite a few polar bears. In the end, they achieved exactly what they had set out to do. It extended Thor Iversen's work into the 2000s, making sure the island's history would not be forgotten. After this expedition, in 2003, Hopen, along with its seas and seabed, finally became protected and safeguarded as a nature reserve. Hopen is used on migration paths for polar bear denning and feeding and as a breeding area for seabirds. Unfortunately, sea ice started to thin out quite a bit over these years, but the weather station overwinterings kept going as normal in the early 2000s. Satellite communications were put in 2008 to make calls and use the internet. This is very important for us because then the Hopen weather station got its own website, and this is one of the very sources that you've been seeing throughout this whole video. Honestly, go and check it out because they have plenty of pages to get lost for hours. To name just a few, about the station and its layout, talking about what they do for work, about the station's dogs, Hopen's geology, what flowers and plants bloom there, a gallery of polar bears, walruses, Arctic foxes and other animals, pictures and details of overwintering crews, a list of overwintering crews from 1943, what jobs they have open, and so much more. They even published their own newspapers, Hopen Times, from 2004 onwards, with photos and articles all in PDF format for you to read. There are blogs from some crews as well. This one from 2010 to 2011 about their work and days there, along with really some truly beautiful photos from the island. And another one from the same year about the journey from start to end, again with great photos. The website itself now hosts the blog for the current crews. Even Gunnar Larsen's son posted a comment about his father's overwintering here. I've also dropped 2 more websites in the description, an article from a guy who visited Joshytta, and a website where you can see quite a few photos of the Hopen weather station. And that's the full story of Hopen. A long, narrow strip of rock, snow and ice that seemed empty, with no street view spheres whatsoever, so small, so isolated and overshadowed by the much bigger and more well-known Spitsbergen, and it turned out to be a wild ride of an island. Hopen has been a hunting ground, a sailing waypoint, German weather outpost, Soviet aircraft crash site, and now a protected nature reserve where polar bears roam and seabirds nest. Thanks so much for coming on this deep dive with me. Every single first-hand source I used is linked in the description, along with links to all the cool websites that I mentioned. If you know anything more about Hopen, or if there's another forgotten place you want me to dig into next, leave it in the comments, and I'll see you all down the next rabbit hole.